In our last story, we heard how David had been anointed by Samuel to be the next king, but he wasn't king yet. King Saul was still in power. And in story 48, we read one of the more probably popular and best known stories in the Old Testament, the story of David and Goliath. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. The Philistines were on a hill on one side of the valley. Israel's men were on the other side, and the valley was between them. A champion who was about 10 feet tall, named Goliath, came out of the Philistine camp each day. On his head he wore a bronze helmet, and he wore a coat of bronze armor that weighed 150 pounds. He wore plates of brass on his legs and carried a bronze javelin on his back. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spearhead weighed 15 pounds. Someone carrying his shield always went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted at the army of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Choose a man and have him come down here. If he can fight and kill me, then we will be your slaves. If I defeat and kill him, you shall be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Choose a man to fight me." When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and terrified. The Philistine made this challenge each morning and evening for 40 days. Now the three oldest sons of Jesse, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema, had followed Saul into battle. David, the youngest, went back and forth between serving Saul and caring for his father's sheep at Bethlehem. One day Jesse said to David, "Take your brothers this corn and these 10 loaves of bread. Give these cheeses to their captain. See how they are doing." David left early in the morning, leaving the sheep with a keeper. He followed Jesse's directions and arrived at the encampment as the army was going out to the battle line, shouting their battle cry. David left the things he had brought with the quartermaster, ran to where the army was, and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, Goliath, the champion of the Philistine, stepped out of the Philistine army line and shouted his usual challenge. David heard what he said. When they saw him, all the soldiers of Israel were terrified and ran away. David asked the men who stood near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" The people answered him, "The king will make the man who kills him rich, give him his daughter to marry, and make his whole family exempt from paying taxes in Israel." "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David exclaimed. People who heard David speak told Saul what he had said, so Saul sent for David. "Let no one be discouraged," David told Saul. "Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." "You can't fight against this Philistine," Saul said to David. "You are only a boy. He has been a warrior from his youth." "Your servant has been caring for his father's sheep," David said to Saul. "When a lion or a bear has come to take a lamb from the flock, I have gone after him, killed him, and freed the lamb. If it attacks me, I grab it by the hair and kill it. I have killed both lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me out of the paws of the lion and the bear will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." "Go," Saul said, "and may the Lord be with you." It's a pretty simple scene. This giant, this Goliath, comes out every day and talks smack to the soldiers of Israel and to Saul's men, basically challenging one of them to come fighting and make it an all for one kind of an event. Man against man, the winner, the other one submits and becomes their servants. Well, Saul and his men are terrified of Goliath. They don't want to have anything to do with him. And we probably shouldn't blame him, because they were looking at it the way the world would. And then along comes David. And David offers us a different perspective, because David sees this giant Goliath, and he doesn't necessarily fear him. He tells Saul about how he has faced down bears and lions, and that God had helped him defeat them. And he said it would be no different in this case, that with God on his side, there's no reason anyone need fear this giant Goliath. Finally, Saul says, all right, give it a try. Then Saul dressed David with his own armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword and tried walking around, for he was not used to all the armor. I can't go with all this, David said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. David took his own staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag, with his sling in his hand. He approached the Philistine. The Philistine walked toward David with the man who carried his shield. When he saw David, he disparaged him because he was so young and handsome. Am I a dog that you come to do battle, that you come to battle me with sticks? He shouted. Then he cursed David by his gods. Come on, he said. I will give your flesh to the birds in the air and the animals in the fields. You come to fight me with a sword, a spear, and a shield, David replied. But I come in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you defy. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will kill you and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of all the Philistines to the birds of the air and the animals in the fields. All the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. Everyone will know that the Lord doesn't use sword and spear to save. This battle is the Lord's. He will give you into our hands. And so the showdown, the stage is set for this showdown. The great and mighty Goliath against the much, much smaller and more diminutive David, who doesn't even have many weapons, simply his sling that he approaches Goliath with. And as the Philistine came closer, David ran toward him and the Philistine army. He put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it, striking the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Not having a sword, David ran to the Philistine, stood over him, drew his sword from its sheath, and used it to cut off his head. When the Philistines saw their champion dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah gave a shout and chased the Philistines out of the valley all the way to Gath and Ekron, leaving many wounded along the way. When they returned, they destroyed the camp of the Philistines. You know, sometimes in our world, when there's a big showdown between two athletic teams, say maybe in basketball, one maybe from a big powerhouse basketball school and the other from a smaller, not well-known school, it's sometimes described as a David versus Goliath kind of a match. And with the thought being that, hey, on any given day, maybe the smaller school can beat the larger school. But this was no David and Goliath story in that way. This was an ungodly, wicked, heathen Philistine who had been mocking the God of Israel. And now David and his incredible spirit-created faith in God and his ability to deliver, David says, I'll face him down, and he does so without balking at all. He flips that rock, smacks Goliath in the head, and the giant falls dead. David then chops off his head, and the ensuing battle commences, with Saul's army sweeping in and doing great damage to the Philistine army that day. But it wasn't that David was so great. It was that his God was so incredible. And almost hidden in the story is that incredible statement that God made, that everyone will know that the Lord doesn't use sword and spear, to save. When Jesus came, great King David's descendant, he would triumph and defeat the three-headed giant of sin, death, and the devil. But he would do so in a very unconventional way, a way that man never expected. He did so by laying down his life, for dying for the sins of the world, and then later taking his life back up after 3 days. So yes, the greater king that would come one day, one of David's descendants, Jesus, would also save and deliver, but not with sword and spear, but by laying down his life for sheep that are all too often timid and afraid because they lose sight of the God that is theirs. In our next story, we learn of a relationship between David and Saul's son Jonathan. After the battle with Goliath, Jonathan, Saul's son, became good friends with David. Jonathan loved him like himself. Saul would not let David go back to his father's home. Jonathan made a pledge of friendship with David because he loved him as his own soul. He gave David the robe that he was wearing, along with his sword, bow, and belt. David did whatever Saul asked him to do and behaved wisely. So Saul placed him in charge of men in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. That sounds good, right? Saul recognizes there's something special about David, and he puts him in charge of things. And everything that he's in charge of, they all begin to like him a lot. A whole lot. Dare I say more than Saul? When David had returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, the women from all the towns of Israel came to meet King Saul, joyfully singing, dancing, and making music. They sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Saul became very angry. The refrain galled him. They give credit to David for killing 10,000s, but they say, "I have only killed thousands." What more can he get but the whole kingdom? From that day on, Saul kept his eye on David, and not in a good way. The next day, an evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he began raving around in his house. David came to play, as he had at other times. Saul had a javelin in his hand, so he threw it at him, shouting, "I will pin you to the wall." David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord had left him, but was with David. Saul removed David from his presence by making him a captain over 1,000 men. David behaved wisely in everything he did, and the Lord was with him. Saul became even more afraid of David, but the people of Israel and Judah loved David. When Michal, Saul's daughter, fell in love with David, it pleased Saul. He thought he could get David killed when he tried to capture a dowry from the Philistines. David acted wisely and wasn't hurt, and Saul gave Michal to be David's wife. Saul knew that the Lord was with David, and his daughter Michal loved him, and he became even more afraid of David. And so Saul was David's enemy continually. When the Philistines attacked, David had more success than the other officers, and his name became well known. God had withdrawn himself from Saul, who had refused to listen, who had refused to follow his instructions. And now that God was with David, and Saul didn't like it, and he didn't like the success David was having, he got jealous, and then he became afraid of David, and the stage was set for the transition. Saul told his son Jonathan and all his servants to kill David. "My father wants to kill you," Jonathan warned David, "so watch out. Hide until morning, when I can talk to my father when he is in the fields. Whatever I find out, I will tell you." Jonathan spoke well of David to his fathers. "Don't let the king sin against his servant David," Jonathan said. "He has done nothing against you. He has only done good to you. He put his own life in danger when he killed the Philistine." The Lord won a great victory for Israel, and you saw it. Why would you want to wrong David, an innocent man, and kill him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and swore that David would not be killed. Jonathan told David all this and brought David back to Saul to serve him as he had done in the past. When David won another battle, the evil spirit again came on Saul as he sat at home with a javelin in his hand. As David played, Saul again tried to pin David to the wall with his javelin, but David slipped away and escaped into the night. David came and spoke to Jonathan. "What have I done? What is my sin? Why does your father want to kill me? Your father knows we are friends, so he won't tell you about his evil plans for me. There is only one step between me and death." "Come, let's go out into the field," Jonathan said to David. When they reached the field, Jonathan said, "I pledge to you by the Lord God of Israel, I'll find out from my father within 3 days if he is going to show goodwill toward you, and I will send you word. If he is planning evil, then I will send you away in peace, and may the Lord be with you, as he was with my father. Only show me the kindness of the Lord while I am living, and when I die, do not stop being kind to my family, even when the Lord has removed all your enemies from the earth." So Jonathan made this covenant with David. This covenant, this pact, this treaty, this contract. The two of them kind of made a deal. In 3 days Jonathan said to David, "Go where you hid the last time by the stone heap. Stay hidden. I will shoot 3 arrows as if to hit a target. If I tell the boy the arrows are closer, then come, for there is peace for you. But if I say the arrows are farther on, go. The Lord is sending you away. May the Lord be our witness forever." So David hid himself in the field. When the new moon was come, the king sat down to eat meat. David's place was empty. Thinking something had happened to make David ceremonially unclean, he didn't say anything. But the next day he asked Jonathan, "Why hasn't David come to eat yesterday or today?" "He begged me to let him go to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice with his brothers," Jonathan answered. "So that's why he isn't here." Then Saul became angry with Jonathan. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, don't you know that when you side with the son of Jesse, you bring disgrace on yourself and your mother? As long as he lives, your right to be king will never be secure. Now go get him, so he can die." "Why should he be killed?" Jonathan answered. "What has he done?" When Saul hurled a javelin at him, hoping to kill him, Jonathan knew that Saul intended to kill David. So he left the table angrily, eating nothing because he felt so sorry that his father had treated David so shamefully. We hear in this part of the story how David is innocent. He has done nothing wrong, and yet Saul wants to kill him. He's jealous of him. His popularity with the people of Israel is annoying the king. The king finds it threatening, and so he wants David dead. And anyone that sides with him, he has no regards for as well. And in this part of the story, if we'll allow, maybe we hear a little bit of the story of Jesus, whom the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and maybe even Pilate and Herod were a bit jealous of, and maybe a bit afraid of. And even though they concluded repeatedly, Herod and Pilate at least, that he had done nothing wrong, that he was an innocent man, nevertheless, the people wanted him killed. They wanted him dead. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field at the time he had set with David, taking a little lad with him. "Run and find the arrows that I shoot," he said to him. As the boy ran, Jonathan shot an arrow way beyond him. When the boy came to the place where the arrow had landed, Jonathan shouted, "Didn't the arrow go farther?" When the boy had gathered the arrows and brought them to his master, Jonathan said, "Hurry, don't stay here. Carry these back to town." As soon as he was gone, David came from his hiding place and bowed down 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and cried together, David sobbing the most. "Go in peace," Jonathan said to David. For we have sworn friendship between us in the name of the Lord. May the Lord be a witness between us and between our descendants forever. Then David left, and Jonathan went back into town. And so the story kind of advances. The animosity from Saul toward David now overflows, and it even affects his relationship with his son Jonathan. And even though Jonathan, as Saul's son, might have normally had a claim to the throne, that's not something that's not worth more to him than his friendship and the covenant, the promise that he had made with David. And in that way, Jonathan can be a bit of a hero for us. And we see in Saul and David an example of one whom the Lord has left and one whom the Lord is with. And there's no doubt which is the better scenario.